I think it is about really trying to focus on the concepts of agility over agile, as it were. Go back to, are we generally working well together and collaborating and have the right behaviours and environment? Do we know what the really important things are that we're going for, and how do we plan accordingly? Learn from what we've done, use data to kind of have those measurement points. I think if we continue on that cycle, we won't go too far wrong.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between Agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard, and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
Hello and welcome to the Product Agility Podcast. It's been a while since I've done an episode, actually. I've had a few weeks off because life and work and stuff like that. And I was sitting down wondering, well, how do I restart the episodes? I need somebody really good to come on to entice everyone back into listening. And that's exactly what we've been able to achieve. Because we have Jag Johal from Jaguar Land Rover. He is the director of Agile Transformation, and somebody that I did get to meet in person when I did a little talk at Jaguar Land Rover. I can't remember how long ago. It feels like in a lifetime, but probably wasn't. And we're just super impressed about the people that got in the organisation, the enthusiasm, the progress they're making. And so it's just so fantastic, Jag, to have you here. Someone that's got such a interesting background, but also really interesting insight into, I suppose, the current state of agility, particularly in your kind of household name of an organisation. So, Jag, thank you so much for coming along and sparing your time for us and the listeners today.
Thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
So it would be brilliant if you could give everyone just a little bit of a background as to kind of, what brings you to the role that you find yourself in today and what it is that you're doing as Director of Agile Transformation at Jaguar Land Rover.
Sure, I'll do my best. So, potted history. I've been working at JLR since I was a grad, but actually my background is all in HR predominantly. So that's where I spent a big chunk of my life. I first came into this agile world 3-4 years ago, and will quite openly share with people that coming into this, clearly had not been part of a software team. I'm not a developer, haven't been a Scrum Master. I could spell the word agile. Was a rugby player in my youth, so knew what Scrum was in that context. And was building my knowledge in this space. But that's where I sort of came into it in terms of the journey we started as a business. They were looking for someone to kind of get involved. There was lots of this that just intuitively just felt right. There's lots of things about this space that I just loved. Won't profess to have anywhere close to the sort of extensive experience of someone like yourself, Ben, or other coaches, etc., that I've come to work with. I do have a passion for making this type of work right, because I think it's so fundamental to helping businesses solve their problems and allow people to be their brilliant best at work. And if there's a mechanism that allows those two things to come together, I think that's something worth pursuing.
Nice, well put. And I think there's this is an interesting situation, right? I think when you haven't been kind of in and around the world for like that long in the grand scheme of things, I honestly think at times that's a bonus. I think it's a benefit to not be kind of, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for, tainted a little bit by some of the machinations and some of the growth and some of the toing and froing. And I think there's a lot to be said for just kind of really understanding it and getting it and kind of maintaining that enthusiasm. And I think that for many people, it's that enthusiasm for Agile, which perhaps is still there, but that is not matched in the market. There is not in anywhere near any way, shape or form the level of market interest for Agile coaches or Scrum Masters or for spending money on Agile training anymore. And I think this is what people are maybe over egging a little bit and saying Agile is dead. And what they're talking about here is that the demand for Agile is dead from a commercial perspective. But I do wonder, is Agile actually dead? Because no one's really leaning into saying, like, what next? Apart from a few, and I must say, a few people, if you go on LinkedIn, there'd always be people talking about what next. I saw that there's been an expansion to the Scrum Guide, which was released last week. Yet more money's making schemes to make money from Agile, but no one's generally saying, here is something which is a free or whatever it is, but here is the serious thing about what next. So I'm wondering, Jag, given your really interesting kind of position in JLR with Jaguar Land Rover, for the people not familiar with that acronym, but what do you think is next?
I think it's taking it back down to some of its basics. At its core, how do you get people working together? Bringing people from different skills and expertise to come and solve a problem. And the reason I believe that, I guess, agility more than agile is arguably as live as ever, is that most businesses have got problems coming out of their ears. The world is just chucking more and more at them. Events of the weekend have added further turmoil to the environment that we're all in. And people are constantly trying to make sense of it. So I actually believe that agility is needed more than ever now, and I think will continue to be needed more. It's about people who can lean into that space, and I think be able to spend time looking at problems, identify what the actual issue is, and then help come up with solutions. I think you said in your last podcast, Ben, it's looking for insights that others don't find easily. That, I think, is a real clue here in terms of what I think people can really offer in this space. Lots of business leaders are very busy trying to solve their particular issues. They don't necessarily have all of the time to take that step back and really look at what is happening across the landscape, the enterprise, inside and outside of the business. That's where I think people in this space can really offer some value, and use insights, use data in its many forms, numerical and non-numerical, to help shape how a business could improve. It's not for you to say that every single idea you will be positioning gets listened to, but help inform a conversation, be part of that dialogue, encourage some feedback back. Yes, that's an insight, Jag, but what I see is this, and not think it's ever a one-way kind of conversation. So the more I look at this space, the more I just think the demand for that kind of conversation is actually just growing and will continue to grow. Just looking at the world around us.
Yeah, and I think that is very, very true. And a lot of this, if you go back to, oh Christ, I'm trying to think what year it was published. I remember in the 90s, there's something called the Fifth Discipline around systems thinking. And it talks about balancing advocacy with inquiry.
Yep.
And I think it's really, really important. And this is what I find really sad is that, do you know what? And all the money that people made from Agile, I don't think anybody really ever pushed those particular types of skill sets, It was always the frameworks and everything else. And so when you say people in this space, you think about kind of the state of Agile, what kind of people are you talking about here? Are you talking about anybody, regardless of their role, or are you thinking specific Scrum Master, Agile coaches? What is in your head when you think of these people that can do this type of thing?
I suppose you naturally would go to, in the first instance, coaches, Scrum Masters, I guess, quote unquote, people those holding Agile roles. But for me, I think this is actually, how do you broaden those types of people enabling that conversation? So I think one of the things that I've observed, rightly or wrongly, and is that to solve complex problems, it requires a range of skills and capabilities to do so. So asking an Agile coach just to do that by themselves is a really difficult ask. If you are leaning into sort of, big, deep-rooted challenges in any business, you need people from different disciplines. So having people with a knowledge and understanding of agility, absolutely, but complementing that with people who understand lean and other delivery mechanisms, I think is really important. Having people who understand process mapping and process excellence. And a really big part of this for me, so I bring this all back down to people, and maybe my background leads me towards that direction, having a really strong humanistic lens to this. How are people interacting together? How are you building the right culture that would allow all of this conversation to happen in the first place? I still think many organisations haven't yet tapped into the brilliance that sits within them, and that many people are constrained by the systems they work in. Those systems were never going to be remedied just by applying an agile methodology of any description. It's more complicated and multifaceted than that. And therefore, I think lots of people have a contribution to enable agility, irrespective of whether you have held a formal agile position, as it were.
So, how do you, in your role, help make those kind of systemic changes happen?
That's a very good question, and you could argue how far we've been able to do that. But I think a big part for me is actually trying to connect various parts and various conversations together. So I think we see lots of people trying to attack the challenges that we have. Again, no necessarily different to lots of other businesses. But it is about drawing on some of the insight. So what have I seen in my time in this business? I've been lucky enough to kind of work across pretty much every single function and discipline. So it's allowed me to have an insight into kind of what are our challenges, what works, and there's lots that does work. And that's the other thing I think sometimes we over-index on. We forget, actually, from an appreciative inquiry perspective, how do you multiply all the stuff that does work, not just look at the problem statements. But being able to kind of draw those capabilities together and then engage with the business on, so where would we focus best on? We've learned a hell of a lot over the last few years, and I think we are still very much on a journey. And if there's one thing I would say, since I started this, it's been the steepest learning curve of my career to date, which has been brilliant in many respects, in terms of just absorbing everything I possibly can around us. And that in itself, I think, is part of it. It's just that learning. Where are you constantly learning, and engaging the leaders in the conversations that would help us drive to better solutions? What is going to matter most to them? We haven't got that right in some instances, and we've been a bit off piece. But I think that for me is the critical question that I keep coming back to and keep asking myself. Are we focused on the things that matter most to the leaders?
But it's a really great thing to say. And I was writing down here, what gets in the way of getting it right. And that last statement there about they really understand giving your leaders what they need or want. But is that then the most difficult problem is when what the leaders are after doesn't align with what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and I think some of that comes back to the insight piece. I think there's a difference between what a business wants and what a business needs. And in stating that need, it is having a degree of bravery and courage to put that out there. But that will come only from a place of genuine insight. Otherwise, it's just another opinion in a potential sea of opinions. And I come back to my point on data, in terms of what are the data points you're using that has given you that insight. And again, I will be very open in terms of my background in this space, but one area I've lent on heavily is from kind of a more organisation development lens, and particularly a dialogic OD lens, which speaks about understanding the system you're in. Not looking from the outside, but being inside it and working collaboratively, but with a very strong democratic, humanistic lens to it. That keeps you focused on people. And I think that's an anchor that is definitely worth holding on to.
So what data points have you found particularly useful in your journey at JLR?
The most useful are the points of where things don't work. So where have we just seen an absence of data in some instances? There is nothing actually that is really meaningful to say something has shifted from A to B. That has been challenging because then you have leaders who do ask you, well, what was the value of what we have just done? The biggest thing I've taken from that is, okay, now what have we learned as a consequence of that? Probably part A, learn not to do that particular thing again. Good. But actually what would allow us to go forward, and where have we seen the greatest interaction? And I think more than anything, having the humility to go, something hasn't worked, is probably one of the biggest data points you can get, because it does engage people in a conversation rather than continuing to push a framework, a methodology. It opens a door to a conversation, I think, in terms of, okay, so what would you do next? Where would you pivot towards? Still a very long way we've got to go in terms of really embedding the concepts of agility, I would say. We have made some huge strides, and I see lots of great conversations happening in this place that maybe we didn't once upon a time, or certainly not to the extent that I think we are able to now. But it's probably in the areas that we actually haven't done as well in, that we thought we might have done better in, that the best data point learning, I think, has actually evidenced itself.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, so you were talking about the absence of data and kind of looking at where things didn't quite work out. But then you did say something earlier, which I thought was great. Something that I've always tried to do, but haven't always succeeded, which is like multiplying what does work. So is that a balance that you've been able to strike? Not just kind of always finding the problems to solve, but also being able to find good examples of stuff that is working well, and have you been able to successfully kind of scale or multiply the effect of those things?
Yeah, because I think I always come back to, we've got some of the most amazing people in this business, and connecting people and getting them to share where they've had successes with others. So not through me or the team per se, but actually enabling and connecting those people in the business to go talk for themselves, and then take those lessons on. Not always intuitive to people, because I think there is this sense of wanting to achieve and wanting to land something for yourself. But one of the things I think I've seen, not just in the agility space, I think I've seen it, we've been on a big cultural journey as a business, massive technical advances that we're making, seeing people lean into spaces where things work and taking those lessons and going, now, how do I not necessarily copy and paste, but there are some certain things in there that means I don't have to start at 0. I can start at 4 out of 10. I've moved a lot quicker already. So I think we're seeing those conversations happen more and more. It's how do we encourage them, I think, particularly when there's pressure on leaders to deliver results quickly. That isn't necessarily the first place you go to. Your first place you go to is let's get going, let's get moving. Not necessarily to pause and reflect and look at what else there is around us.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. Some of the stuff you said then just gave me like 100 different questions to ask, and so I'm going to try and weave through. There were two of my favourite ones here. I'm really interested to know, with the whole agile is dead, long live agility, however we kind of phrase it, happening in the market. And you being on your agile journey internally, and finding ways to kind of get benefit from agility, and I guess for you the whole kind of agile is dead thing internally isn't like it's not getting in the way of anything. But I'm just wondering, how has the narrative and what's been happening in the market affected your ability to kind of embrace your journey? Have you had to pivot? Have you stuck with it? Have you had to stop using language and just talk about the what next? Has it affected you internally at all?
I wouldn't say that conversation has necessarily affected us. I think certainly those in quote unquote the Agile community are aware of it and talk about it. But in terms of general conversations I hear in the business, not really part of the vernacular. I think, however, parallel to that, internally those types of similar questions are being posed in various places. So almost without the influence of the external conversation, it is a mirror of what I'm hearing and picking up, which is, are we really gaining traction? Are we getting the value that we wanted from this? So the parallels are actually quite stark. Where I think at a point of pivoting, increasingly you hear lots of people talk, as you know, where we are talking about agility rather than agile. We're talking about how do we plan better, how do we prioritize better, how do we work better together, trying to drop some of the more formal aspects of it. At the same time, how are we trying to enable a level of consistency? Because one of our challenges is working across a system in what is a complex business that has both hardware and software as intrinsic parts of it, that allow lots of people to integrate together to create a product on time, to cost, to quality. That is a set of complexities that is still very much a work in progress. But some of it comes down to working to the principles rather than pushing formal agile concepts or methodologies, I think. And as ever, there's a balance. And that's what I'd also strive to say. You know, there is a place for consistency and alignment because it does help bigger organizations. So while I think to some degree frameworks can be maligned, much of it is about the application of them. And also making it relevant to the context in which you're in. Just generically applying it is likely to not be successful. If you can tune it to something that works for you, then you're in a different ballpark.
Yeah, but it's like tuning it with purpose, isn't it? It's really understanding like where you're trying to go and how you want to get there, and being able to tune it, you know, intelligently with purpose rather than just using the framework, but you're just basically doing what you're doing before, but with some new labels.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's the key to success for me. Labeling things and calling things differently, just all putting the word agile in front of it. Generally not had too much success with it. And people see through it. They're too intelligent, too clever not to.
Yeah. And this is the other part of that was in my head around this. When you think about like, what next with agile, the commercial industrial complex that is agile, kind of being on its being on the ropes, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think people made enough money, and if they didn't save it, then it reminds me of there's that documentary on Netflix about a Premiership football player who basically was a decent Premiership football player and just always thought he was going to have loads of money, and then turns out he wasn't very good at football anymore, relatively speaking, and didn't have any money.
It ran out.
Yeah, so he didn't do that planning, you know, and so I don't get me wrong, I'm in a fortunate position where my business didn't really depend upon agile overly, so I've done okay. But when we think about what next, you know, it isn't going to be more frameworks and it isn't going to be more certificates. But what I wonder is, I think there's two things I'm interested in. One, I think will maybe interest listeners more than the other. One is I'd be really fascinated if you can share anything about what it's like working, at JLR, with the rise of like EV cars, and then the shift that means from the software and hardware, that integration perspective. Because I guess historically the software was a critical part of a car, and now it's kind of like it's the brain, the bigger brain of the car. So I find that really interesting. But then on the flip side, and still relevant, and what next? AI. How is AI going to affect what happens next? And can there be benefits to people, instead of spending their time attending training courses, actually finding new ways to work with various different forms of AI models? So you can pick and choose how you want to answer that or not answer any of those questions, Jag. But those are the two things that are really kind of bubbling away in my head.
Yeah, no, they're both great questions. I suppose in some respects, we're no different to lots of the automotive industry in terms of the rate of change, unprecedented. So even from my time, and again, I'm not an engineer or work in the technical space per se, but the things that car companies are doing now are just different from 10 years ago. Challenges around EV, what the world of autonomous driving might look like, just the sheer quantity of code that now sits on the car compared to what used to be there. It is mind-boggling in terms of the complexity that these vehicles now have, and the demands upon them by the customer have also grown. The expectations of what people want to do with cars, again, is just changing before our eyes. So keeping up with that is actually just really hard in the first place. And how we then use that as an opportunity, I think, is kind of the critical bit. So enabling us to find a place in the market that makes us attractive. People want to come back to us. People want to be part of something that's maybe beyond just the vehicles. And then again, I come back to, so how are we enabling our people and creating a system that is really going to drive that? Recognizing that literally every day is a learning day. And somewhere in that journey, AI does sit apart. For me, it just feels like that space has accelerated in just the last 6 to 9 months, I think, in terms of new tools that are coming out. We obviously saw, the Seeker app come out, etc. It's challenging some of the status quo that we know. And how, again, are we using that, but in the right way? I don't profess to be an AI expert at all either, actually. And it's still something I'm learning lots about, like others. There is definitely something in that space about how we're enabling work to be done, decisions to be made quicker, information to be processed quicker. But at the heart of it, how are we retaining an authenticity about who we are as a business? What do we stand for? That comes from people, in my point of view, or always will. And maybe I'm a Luddite and haven't quite caught on to this just yet. But that passion, that desire, the thing about our place is, it doesn't matter whether you don't just have to be an engineer. The passion for our vehicles runs throughout the whole place. It's always been one of the things that has struck me, and we see that translate itself into the customer base. There's a connection we form with our customers through our vehicles, which is unique.
And have you ever found that to be, I don't know, anything but a positive when you're working with teams and you're kind of explaining about agility and that about the proximity to the customers and the users? So have you found that an easier one to square off, given that I suppose maybe a lot of people that work in your organization are also customers, or at least kind of appreciate the brand?
Generally, yes. I think there's an ongoing desire to, so how do you make these products the best they possibly can be? The challenge often will be how you integrate it all together and create a package that really does make sense for the customer. And again, those are trade-offs. Those are decisions on what particular customers want, could be cost, etc. And that's where I keep coming back to the fact that that's where agility lives. You've got to make you've got to have those conversations real and be able to be nimble enough to be able to make those types of moves and respond to kind of what's happening in the market rather than just react to what's happening out there. How do you give yourself permission to play and keep yourself in a place where you can continue to be innovative, but you're coming from a point of view of strength rather than reacting to what you're seeing elsewhere in the marketplace? And it goes back to the question you asked earlier, Ben, about what does, who are these people? Well, that's why I keep coming back to the fact that this is everybody. Agility is not just for a chosen few. I think agility is something that everyone in a business needs to encapsulate in some way, shape or form, and be able to have the mindset, the dexterity of thinking to enable that to live in whatever product or service they're producing.
Yeah, fascinating. I think it's such an interesting environment in which you work. 'Cause I think for many listeners that you can really comprehend just the scale of all the different people that are involved. In what it takes to kind of get your products, of which there are many, into people's say hands, but get it physically with a customer. There's a colossal amount of energy and time and thought and conversation that needs to happen. I think so I wonder how much the listeners are kind of listening to this and just not getting just maybe the sheer scale of what it is that you're having to do here on a daily basis. And so I'm wondering is if you think to the future, Jack, and you think of the challenges that are on the horizon, what's your what next when it comes to transformation at JLR?
I think it is about really trying to focus on the concepts of agility over agile, as it were. Go back to are we generally working well together and collaborating and have the right behaviours and environment? Do we know what the really important things are that we're going for, and how do we plan accordingly? Learn from what we've done and use data to kind of have those measurement points. I think if we continue on that cycle, we won't go too far wrong. And I think, again, that is incumbent on all of us in this place to try and bring a part of. And lots of people already do. That's the thing. It's about how do we now try to bring this together in a bit more of a systemic manner, I suppose. Really try and bed some of the skills that we've started to talk about. Make it part of everyday life, not something different, not something to be added onto to be over and above what people's working lives are. We've got to make people's working lives as easy as possible. That hasn't always been the case. And allow the brilliant engineers to engineer, to allow the brilliant procurement people to buy all of the required parts, the commercial people to showcase what they can do in terms of attracting and retaining people. And I think it's something that's a lot quieter. It's a lot more subtle. It's in the background. It's not bells and whistles. It's not shouting from the rooftops. But just over time, it becomes part of everyday life. And when it's not a thing anymore, that's when I think we've hit a success point.
No, that's a beautiful insight, I think. I was loving what you were saying there about it not being this big show of agile or agility or transformation, but that when people just have doing it in the background, and when it's happening and no one's talking about it, then maybe that's the ultimate marker of success of all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, have you found that there's a particular area where you were surprised at the level of traction that you got in people going to change in the conversations that they had?
I wouldn't say there's a particular area. I think we definitely saw lots of people up for this conversation across different parts of the business, actually, and the pull almost was really hard to manage, just because, again, you referenced scale earlier, and that's probably been one of our biggest challenges. Inevitably, what you get good challenge from people in terms of, but what about? I've always worked this way, and you haven't really sold why it's going to be any better, Jack. Or really valid, actually, and I think they help the conversation. But I think I was always quite positively encouraged and remain encouraged about people want to challenge the status quo. People want to make things better. And from my perspective, again, I go back to the sort of previous point. If in making things better, it has absolutely nothing to do with agile, I'm all good for that. If the thing that you're trying to get better and the problem you're trying to solve can be solved. If in some small way what we've done is we've enabled a conversation to highlight that, and then the path has been chosen to make something better that is a different path, then that's our job done in this particular instance. So, Yeah, lots of brilliant conversations we have, and as many of the conversations I have that I would deem as brilliant are the ones I are hugely challenging. It's so show me, Jag, where this really has made the impact, because that you've got people really applying a critical lens, and I don't mean that in the term critically. They are offering some level of critical analysis of which you've got to lean back into. That tests your resolve. Well, okay, you've got a point. We're not good enough at that. How do we go further? So I think it's of the last few years, I've lost count of the number of great conversations I've had, many to the extent that I'll finish the week and my head will hurt, not quite know what to do with some of them. And there's probably a list that's at my desk at the moment of things to pick back up. But constantly amazed about the genuine intent we have in people who do want to make this system better and better, agnostic of whichever particular methodology you go after.
That's what, Jag. I always like to end the episode on a high, on a positive note, and I feel that maybe that was it. I really like your approach to all of it. I think so many transformations just never delivered anything. And it was about the song and the dance of it all, and it was the bells and whistles, and it was the frameworks. But it sounds like what you've got is a really sustainable and pragmatic approach. I think it's really nice to hear. Really nice to hear. Is there anything that you wanted to share, but maybe I haven't given you opportunity to during our conversation that you want to kind of just as the icing on the cake?
Probably just there's a massive thank you, I think, in there to all of the people I've had the privilege of meeting over the last few years in this space, that had I not taken on this particular challenge, I probably wouldn't have met. And in some way, shape or form, they've all helped my learning. I've taken things from pretty much most people I speak to. It doesn't always help, because sometimes my ideas kind of over-explode and I'm not quite sure what to do with them, and they sort of fall under their own magnificence. But I think the everyone I've come in contact with in this space, be it the coaches, the scrum masters, the product owners, people outside of this business that I've also been leaning into to listen and learn from, have all in some way, shape or form helped. And I think it, again, just reiterates what sits at the heart of all of this: great conversations. If you have great conversations, you'll stitch something together. So I'm hugely appreciative of the time that people have given me. And like I said, at the very start, I go back to the fact that I'm leaning into a space that I don't have 15, 20 years experience of. Others do. And they've been hugely invaluable to help me develop my thinking and our collective approach. This isn't about me or I. If the moment I start speaking about that, then we've lost. This is very much an hour game.
Awesome. Yeah, lovely. End it on a high. Thank you very much, Jag. It's nice. I love the fact you took the opportunity to kind of thank all those people, because that is it's a wonderful thing to do. And I think you're a nice human. It's been a pleasure to have you on for this first episode in a while. And I'm hoping that we can only continue to keep the bar this high over the coming weeks. So, Jag, you've set a very hard bar for me to kind of to reach. So thank you very much for coming on and sharing your insights and being so open and humble. It's been a joy to have you on.
No problem. Really appreciate the time. Great conversation. Thank you.
And everyone, thank you very much for hanging around and listening to us. Hopefully we'll be back again in the very foreseeable future with another excellent guest, or maybe just me trying to be as excellent, but on my own. We shall wait and see. So thank you everyone for listening. This has been the Product Agility Podcast.